taught at several, much as I have taught in several universities uh, around the world, I am so honored to be able to teach at this University of Jaffna, which is the university of the city in which I was born. So it gives me very great pleasure to be with you today to talk on the subject on which I have written most of my life, the international law on foreign investment. It is a subject which falls within public international law, a subject, no doubt, which is taught at the University of Jaffna in the law program. The international law on foreign investment, as you would gather, is the law that is designed to protect the flows of investments that take place from one country into another. So it ensures or seeks to create standards of protection for foreign investors who make investments in a host country, like Sri Lanka, for example. So we have customary international law, which it is said, particularly by the developed states of the world, which have created certain rules relating to the protection of foreign investments. The more usual pattern now in the modern world is to create investment treaties, normally on a bilateral basis, which contain statements as to the standards of protection and as to what should happen in the event of expropriation of investments by the host country. So that generally is the range of international investment law. It seeks to give the foreign investor virtually a unilateral right to have recourse to arbitration against the host state in the event of standard of protection or in the event of expropriation without compensation before a foreign arbitration tribunal. So the protection device that has been created under these treaties is very strong. We are told that international law is defective because of the fact that it doesn't have any mechanisms for enforcement. But that is not so in the area of foreign investment because of the existence of very strong systems of arbitration that ensure that the foreign investor who has been affected by measures taken by a host state is given relief through remedies for compensation. So that's the outline of the law, basically. Of course, the law is pretty vast. And as I said, I have given a lifetime to research in this area, and so have many other more eminent international lawyers than I. So this is a growing area of the law. And of course, it is an area of practice because the large law firms of the world specialize in this particular area of investment protection because foreign investments are made largely by the very large multinational corporations taking investments to different parts of the world. So as you can imagine, the law has been constructed virtually by the very powerful states of the world, and the different countries like Sri Lanka are at the vipping end. And the theory that I use in my study of India, which concentrates on the extent to which power in shaping the law. That's easy to indicate when international law constructed in the time in connection with the relationship between the imperial powers like Great Britain and the colonizer or Sri Lanka. Clearly then the law was constructed in such a manner as would favor the interests of the developed world. Given that context, given the context that the law has been created in the context of power, one must look at the present situation in which we find international law to be in. Whereas in the past, one could analyze international law in the context of power, there are two important factors that are taking place in the world which would counter this analysis relating to power and the need to resist power. One, of course, is the issue of climate change. For the first time in the world, we find that problems relating to climate change are affecting the whole world. In the United States, we hear of large droughts, about heat waves, which result in the killing of a large number of people. We are told that people have to go into airports so that they could escape from the heat. There are special areas that to ensure that there is sufficient air condition people from extreme weather patterns that have resulted. So that in winter time, there are rains that create vast floods that affect problem that's common to the whole world. And for one, like in the past, where there were power imbalances, we are confronted with an issue that affects the whole world. The COVID pandemic is somewhat similar in the sense that the whole world is faced with this pandemic that is created in the sense that the rich world can afford the vaccines that have come into prominence. And of course, they invented them and they can utilize those vaccines to protect their people. But this protection, again, is a bit of a difficulty because of the fact that new types of viruses would be created in the third world, in Africa or in Asia, as the current virus was created in India, and that virus could be taken to the developed world. So you cannot escape the fact that the COVID pandemic poses a truly international problem. So whereas in the past, international law was created in the context of an imbalance between the very powerful states of the world and the powerless states of the developing countries, that analysis will not be applicable to the present world, probably, in which the dominating factors are the presence of climate change and the COVID pandemic. So clearly then, there is a need for a new approach to international law, an approach that comes about as a result of the creation of two problems which the whole of humanity shares. You know, it's not a problem that affects only the poor man, it affects the rich man equally. And there's no way in which the rich man can escape from the pandemic. Maybe he has access to better vaccines, but the mutating virus will probably come and reach into his home and affect his family as well. So the interdependence of the world has been clearly demonstrated by these two factors. So given that, my argument today is that one must think in terms of the shaping of new rules relating to international law. And my task with you today is to concentrate on the law relating to foreign investment. The law relating to foreign investment, you must look at it both from the domestic point of view as well as from the international law point of view. From the domestic point of view, we are familiar with the domestic law, for example, of Sri Lanka. The concentration is on making your country as attractive as possible to foreign investment. So, for example, we have in our law a Board of Investment, which is touted to be a one-stop center for the admission of foreign investments. The Board of Investments goes around the world touting Sri Lanka as a great place for investments. Now, that idea, of course, has been operated on for a long period of time. So it's based upon neoliberal theory that more foreign investment comes into a country, the better are the chances of economic development for that country. So we have toyed with that idea for a long time. The initiator of it perhaps was President Jayawardena, who was president in the 1970s. But there's no visible sign of many developments in many economic development projects having initiated as a result of the adoption of a very pro-foreign investment policy in Sri Lanka. We cannot, the product of development that has arisen as a result of the reception of such investments. So the techniques that are adopted are pretty common. They are the techniques that are adopted not only in Sri Lanka, but in other developing countries of the world. What you would do is give as much tax incentives as possible, as Sri Lanka has done for foreign investors. Then you give exemptions from customs regulations for the import of various products into the country. You're given access to free economic zone. Zone is created in which foreign investment could establish itself. Then there are facilities provided for the transport of manufactured and other goods to the port. Port facilities are generously provided. So this is a strategy that has been adopted for foreign investment for a long period of time. The other theory, of course, is that the law must end stability. So this would mean that you must have labor laws that ensure that there are no not argue for better standards of protection, better workplaces, more health facilities, more pension rights. Trade unions must be muscled and stability must be kept. So this idea of stability means that you must have an authoritarian regime. So then, of course, you would think in terms of a constitutional system that ensures that there is a strong man at the top and that this strong man keeps the law, which would mean that there would be an erosion of labor standards. There would be less environmental protection because more rules on environmental protection, the displeasure that is caused in the foreign investor would be great, and he might leave the country and go elsewhere. So the idea of attracting foreign investment is a difficult idea because of the fact that you have to maintain lower standards of labor laws, you have to have lesser environmental protection, and of course, human rights standards are affected because keeping stability would mean that would have to listen people. They do not have ready access to the courts. And also, one could argue that a resulting phenomenon is that the system of courts in the country would become affected because the courts would not readily provide relief to affected people. So you have to sort of think of foreign investment with pluses and minuses. It is true that money does come in. It is true that some people get work, particularly people working in factories like the production of clothing and materials of that sort. But this is all low technology work. It's not work that requires high technology, but the packing of people into workplaces, constant repetitive work that is given to them at very low wages. So that picture probably has to change too, because we have to think of a new system in the context of the COVID issues that have arisen that would be more conscious of the rights of people, the requirements that life is after all very short, that people could die all of a sudden as a result of pandemics, that that there is a rethinking about the nature of life itself. One would probably say that people have perhaps have enough time to become rather spiritual and not be selfish about seeking after too many material comforts, as was the case in the 1990s and at the turn of this millennium. So it could well be, and I would argue that this is the case, and I hope it is the case, that there would be a sort of a reversal of the law towards non-economic factors. I mean, when you think in terms of foreign investment, you're only thinking in terms of economic development, the receipt of money, and the creation of more money. Rather, I would think that the law should shift now to looking at things like the protection of the environment, ensuring a good, clean environment to the people, to the protection of human rights, rather than the maintenance of stability for the betterment of the foreign investor. So this would mean that even the domestic law probably would have to change without giving too much of emphasis on this this mythical idea that the flow of foreign investments is going to solve all the economic ills of Sri Lanka or of the northern province of Sri Lanka, the Jaffna Peninsula, or the eastern province. That's not going to happen because, I mean, the type of investments that we have thought of in Sri Lanka are largely investments in the garment sector and investments in the tourist sector, both of which are affected very much by things like the pandemic. One would think that the pandemic spreads very rapidly as a result of workers being kept under bad conditions in confined spaces. So too in the case of tourism, it's tourism that brings the germs into Sri Lanka. So one would have to radically rethink the domestic law relating to foreign investment. No doubt there would be a lot of people from the Board of Investments and the business people saying more investments, the better. But one has to sort of step back and see whether this idea, this mirage that has been created, that foreign investment is going to solve all the difficulties of Sri Lanka, are really true, whether it would really come about or not. Now I go to international law, which is, as I said, related to the domestic law. You cannot think of domestic law without thinking of international law, and you cannot think of international law without thinking of domestic law, because it is international law which shapes domestic law, and it is the reception of international law into domestic law that makes international law meaningful. So what is the international law on foreign investment? So far, international law on foreign investment has been geared once more, like the domestic law, to the free flow of investments around the world. So we have this idea of globalization that was in vogue in the 1990s and in the first part of this millennium, that the greater flows of foreign investment, the greater would the prosperity of the world. Is that's the basis on which international law is created and is maintained even to this day, that more investments flow, the greater is the prosperity. We haven't seen that taking place. I mean, foreign investors come into a country, say in the oil industry, they pull the oil out, leaving little behind for the people of the country. Or the resource-rich countries of the world like Zambia, Papua New Guinea, resources are taken out, but they still remain very poor countries. So this is a phenomenon that has been going on right around the world throughout history. I mean, why is Nigeria not a rich country? I mean, oil, the wealth that is created through oil would make the people of that country a rich people, but they are not. Instead, what would happen is that the multinational companies that take this oil out, like Shell, become very rich. So one has to pause and rethink what is going on here. Is it true that as international law, investment, on the myth that such free flows of funds would be possible to give economic proof of this, or is it just a sort of mythical statement that is propagated in order to maintain a particular set of rules that are so protective of the interests of the large multinational companies like Shell? Shell, as you know, has so much of litigation against it relating to pollution, but it somehow is able to wriggle out of ignition. Being a classic example, they have brought so many different actions for environmental damage caused by Shell, but they have not been able to get much relief. So this is an ongoing phenomenon. This myth is kept in order to retain a system of law in place that the law that is created is so beneficial to the poorer people of the world that they must continue to keep this law afloat. So we get investment treaties made. Sri Lanka, as you know, has so many investment treaties. Investment treaties are made, but actions are brought on the basis of these investment treaties. And of course, one finds that poor countries have to pay of money to foreign investors who have been affected by measures taken by the state. So Pakistan, for example, had to pay a $6 billion damages in an arbitration brought by a foreign oil company against Pakistan just about 2 months back. So to Nigeria, again, $6 billion by way of damages. I mean, these damages are huge, and a poor country can hardly afford to pay such damages. So we come to the pandemic. I mean, and the pandemic is a good instance because of the fact that states have had to break many contracts, have to take measures that are greatly harmful to businesses. And of course, the question arises, what would happen after the pandemic is over? Some lawyers believe that at the end of the pandemic, there would be an immense number of lawsuits and arbitrations brought against governments of different countries for having violated contracts, for having violated standards of protection that are required by treaties. So each time you have a lockdown, you're going to affect business because lockdown means that if there's a foreign hotel, tourists cannot come to that hotel. That hotel has to be shut up, and that hotel is going to lose money. So the issue arises, can the owners of the hotel sue the country because of the fact that the lockdown measures resulted in tourist flows being stopped? So Sri Lanka, as you know, has foreign hotels, not many of them, but the two big hotels at Gulf face, one is owned by the Indian Tourist Corporation, the other by Singapore interest, the large hotel that has newly come up. So the question is, I mean, these hotels have had to remain without tourists for a long periods of time. And can they now turn back and say that it is because of the lockdown measures that they lost the profits that they would have made during this period of COVID? Another situation would be protection of patents and trademarks. The COVID vaccines would have trademark protection. In the event of, say, a government buying a cheaper a clone or something that is cheaply produced by a third world pharmaceutical company, could it be that patent rights and copyrights and trademark rights are violated? An issue, as you know, that is very similar to the one that arose during the AIDS epidemic. When you have an AIDS drug that is manufactured by a pharmaceutical company in the United States, and the Indians produce a clone of that drug, which is much cheaper. The question then becomes as to whether there is a violation of the patent or the trademark for that particular vaccine. So these are the sort of issues that come about when a pandemic of this sort arises. What would happen in the pandemic is that every country in the world, not only Sri Lanka or India, but every country in the world would have to take regulatory measures that would ease or prevent the spread of the pandemic in the country. So it would mean taking measures like the lockdown, preventing travel within the country, stopping executives from abroad coming into manufacturing plants in Sri Lanka. It is claimed that it's some of the Indian executives who brought the Indian version of the virus into garment factories in Sri Lanka. So these are the instances that would happen, that the state would have to intervene far more often than it had previously, right? I mean, that is something that we see happening every day in Sri Lanka. The lockdown measures, the measures that prevent travel between provinces, the shutting down of many factories, many areas in which the COVID virus is spreading. So the government then is far more intensely regulatory in periods of the pandemic than in the past. So even if the government has a philosophy of not intervening too much in the life of the citizen, that philosophy simply has to be given up in times of pandemics. So the problem that is going to arise once the pandemic is over is whether there would be a greater number of lawsuits that come about as a result of the pandemic. So I have sort of contemplated this matter in some of my recent writings, and I argued that as others have argued, I mean, some would say that such litigation would succeed, but my argument is that this is a situation of necessity, and that the state intervention in order to protect the health of its people must be regarded as a situation that justifies state interference, the final justification being provided by a doctrine such as the doctrine of necessity. So again, we have to scour the field to see whether such a defense would succeed. The country which has most often pleaded the defense of necessity is Argentina, where an economic crisis took place at the turn of this millennium, and some 52 actions were brought against Argentina in respect of the measures it had taken in order to curb the economic crisis. One measure was the devaluation of the Argentine crisis. So earlier, the Argentine peso was the equal of an American dollar. After devaluation, the Argentine peso became 70 cents to the American dollar. So 30 cents had somehow disappeared. So if it was a large sum, then you're thinking in terms of millions being lost as a result of the devaluation that had taken place in Argentina. The question that arose in all these cases was that this devaluation could amount to an expropriation because of the fact that money that was there, the $100 that was there, is now just $70 because $30 had been taken off from your pocket. So this is the theory that was adopted in the Argentine cases, the 52 cases I tell you about, and most of those cases succeeded, despite the fact that Argentina pleaded the doctrine of necessity. The doctrine of necessity being that Argentina was faced with a economic crisis, that it was left without any money, and that as a result, it could not feed its people. Therefore, it had to take certain economic measures like devaluations in order to prevent the economic crisis setting in harder. But as I said, this defense was the defense, like why not get a loan from the IMF? So that's a sort of a solution of the developed countries. I mean, you have an economic crisis, you go to the IMF, which is a bank created by the United States, Japan, and other developed countries, and get a loan from them. Of course, the loans are given on condition that you follow certain prescriptions, economic prescriptions, like free entry of foreign investments into your country. So that is the cycle that you're faced with when you have these strong laws on foreign investment. So my argument is that the fact that this economic crisis has come about, which affects not only the poor countries, but also the rich countries, would mean that the rich countries would now be amenable to the idea that the law must be changed. So I would argue that in respect of the pandemic, the crisis that has been created by this pandemic, there would be a lowering of the standards of protection of foreign investment, that there would be a greater need for defenses like the defense of necessity succeeding. So we are at a crucial point here because of this pandemic and because of other factors as well. You know, the other factor, of course, which I must mention and which is of great relevance to us in Sri Lanka, is the rise of China. You know, much of the law so far has been created by just one country, the United States, which was a preeminent power. I mean, it was the sole great power that remained after the collapse of the Soviet Union for some 20 years. But now that picture is changing. The picture is that there is a rapid rise of China, and China is becoming a large investor of capital in foreign countries. So if you look at, if you ask the question, who is the largest foreign investor in the world, you would immediately come up with the answer, it's the United States. But that answer is no longer possible because of this rise of China and the huge war chest of money that China has, some $3 trillion in its sovereign wealth bank. So there's a new picture that is emerging. The fact that China is so powerful, the fact that China has this Belt Road Initiative in which it seeks to take investments all around the world, into Africa, into Asia, including Sri Lanka, build a port city here, ensure that it has a toehold, and of course, the toehold will become a larger hold in time to come. This would mean that the balance of power in investment is shifting from the rich world, which used to be the European world and the United States, into other countries, principally China, and to a lesser extent, of course, India. So it's in that context also that you have to look at the changes that are taking place. The pandemic accelerates those changes. So my vision or view of things would be that law is going to change. The Americans are going to use national security as a defense far more than they would have used in the past. You can see that in the case of the Huawei incident in the United States, when Huawei showed a rise in its market strength in the United States. The United States hit back by saying that the presence of Huawei in the United States is a national security threat. So here we have the situation that the United States is announcing that it is going to use this defense of national security far more than it used in the past. So every time a large multinational from China, and you know that the Chinese don't have multinationals, they have state-owned corporations like the China Harbour Engineering Company, which built the port city. That's a huge Chinese state-owned corporation. So whereas a multinational corporation is a private entity, a Chinese state-owned corporation is very much an arm of the Chinese government. So that's going to be an interesting phenomenon too, that investments of a large nature, like in the case of Huawei, which of course is put forward as a private company, but nevertheless is to a large extent owned by government interests in China. They are going to be the largest investors among the largest investors in the world, which would mean that you cannot continue to maintain the same laws that you maintained before. So you have to think in terms of a conjunction of factors that are coming together. The climate change factor, the pandemic, which I have spoken to you about, and the third factor is the rapid rise of China and the new type of investments that China is bringing into the fold. So given these changes, I would say that the international law on foreign investment is ripe for change, and that in the future, the chances are that there would be a greater consciousness of matters like human rights, the promotion of just not economic development, but what is referred to as sustainable development, having regard to whether or not the investment that is made is protective of the climate, the resources of the people, whether the people can sustain themselves despite the depletion that is caused by the extraction of resources. So all these factors would have to be taken into account in constructing the international law on foreign investment. So finally, before I conclude, let me also tell you about the approach to international law generally, and in particular to this subject of the international law on foreign investment, which I have taken in the course of my writings. So much of my writing is shaped by this idea of power being a determinant in the fashioning of the rules of international law. And of course, that's easily demonstrable because of the fact that in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, these powerful states of Europe designed and made international law in a manner that would promote their interests. So I would say that early incipient international law on foreign investment was totally geared to the protection of investments, multinational companies that were headquartered in the large companies of the world. And of course, the freedom movements came about in Asia and Africa, and we tried to reform the law without too much of success. Eventually, we were forced, in a sense, to make bilateral investment treaties that ensured that much of the old law that did exist in times of colonialism was retained and is retained to a large extent now. As I said, the international law on foreign investment is perhaps more effective than any other branch of foreign investment because of the system of enforcement through arbitrations. You know that there was an arbitration award against India made recently, and the French courts have issued an order saying that investment award could be enforced by seizing Air India planes that fly into Paris. So that means that these investment laws, which are international law in reality, and some say that international law doesn't bind, but it does bite. It can be enforced through the system of courts. So power is a determinant factor. And what is left, of course, for the developing countries, for the rest of humanity, is to resist these rules relating to power through countering them by articulating rules based upon what I would term justice. It's a sort of a idea that resistance brings about rules of justice. So there's a clash that takes place, and it's a sort of a perennial clash, which means that the law is never sort of a certain system of law that it is always in a state of flux, requiring careful study to determine at which time the interests of power become strong, and at which time the interests of those who resist become strong. So in this eternal struggle that goes on, you have to sort of find the exact spot at which you could state the law is in. So that's a sort of a interesting way to study law, in the sense that you can see law as a clash, a continuing clash of interests. And at this time, when there is the pandemic, the climate change instance, and the rapid rise of China and India, you can see that there is a continuous and continuing need to study international law, particularly, but I would suggest all law in the context of this idea that the context, the history, the culture, and other factors come into the shaping of the law. So let me stop there then. And if you do have any questions, I will answer them. Thank you so very much for listening to me. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for your much informative sessions. And it's a question and answer sessions. And participants, you can ask questions directly to the sir.
Dear sir, my name is Minindu Vilayagada.
I'll say that again. Mihindu Vilayagada. I got it. You got 4 people there. Which one is you?
Sir, I am the one in red, sir.
All right. Yes, you look very smart.
Thank you so much, sir. As you do. So,
yes, Minindu, tell me. Yeah.
So I am a